Welcome to BizTech's Jobs and Careers Show. Our conversation for today is with Dr. Izzhar Putra bin Amirudin. He's the head of new business at Pathology Asia. Now, Dr. Izzhar is here to speak on the topic of climbing the corporate ladder as a doctor. Now, during the conversation, he will share his experience as a medical practitioner who has moved into the corporate world and talk about transferable skills which doctors possess that will help them to succeed in the corporate arena. Now, this interview is part of our media partnership with Diverse Career Summit. Now, for starters, tell us a little bit about yourself, your educational background, history, and so forth.
Sure, Brian. I am a medical doctor, but I haven't seen a patient since, I guess it was 2011, so quite a while back. And I've made the career switch, as you rightly said, to the private healthcare space, where I've done a number of commercial-based roles in various industries, primarily in pharmaceuticals, as well as clinical diagnostics. As you rightly said, I am currently the head of new business for Pathology Asia, which is Southeast Asia's largest clinical diagnostics group. We basically have a presence in pretty much every country in the region. And I'm also an alternate director for one of the laboratories here based in Malaysia. I am Malaysian, but I would say my hometown is actually in Brunei. That's where I was born and raised there. My father was a GP, and I spent nearly 10 years living in London. That's where I acquired my medical training. And subsequently after that, I returned to Malaysia to continue my medical practice here. And I also did a stint in Singapore as well for about a year and a half, where I did my master's and I also did some work there as well.
Okay, so tell us, what made you transition from being a medical practitioner and switching over to the administrative or corporate side of medicine?
Right. So that's a bit of a long story, but I'll try to summarize it as best as I can. It was really, the turning point came when I was working here as a contract medical officer for a local hospital. I was working in the emergency department. And as you may be aware, contract doctors here in Malaysia do have a tough time trying to find something permanent, something more concrete following their stint. I happened to actually, after 4 months of working as a contract medical officer, I happened to actually be given the opportunity to pursue a master's in emergency medicine granted by the hospital. And the turning point was to decide whether to accept it or not. Around this time, my interest in medicine started to diminish a little bit, primarily because I realized that there was more, to the outside world than just what I know, which was clinical medicine. So I already had kind of doubts whether this is something that I wanted to do, for a long period of time till I retire. On top of that, during that 4 months when I was working in the hospital, let's just say whatever that you may have read in the papers regarding junior doctors being bullied or mistreated or subjected to some kind of abuse. All those things I would say are true, because I went through something similar like that at the department that I was working at. So on top of that, there's a lot of different things that I experienced here in Malaysia working as a doctor compared to in the UK. For instance, the kind of diseases and cases that you see are very different. Mm-hmm. I remember vividly seeing my first case of dengue here, which I've never seen in the UK. So I really was struggling to figure out what was wrong with the patient. So I really needed a lot more time to adjust and to adapt in this working environment. So when it came to the point where this medical board asked me whether I was interested to actually pursue a master's program, which is a very long commitment, it was more than 10 years, I believe. I basically gave them a very honest answer and said, thank you very much, but I still feel that I need more time to adapt and get more experience working here, particularly in this environment. Mm-hmm. And maybe we can revisit this opportunity later on. So they didn't like that answer. And pretty much a few days after that, I was basically informed that my contract was terminated and there was no need for my services at the hospital. So it was that point where it really made sense for me to actually pursue other things outside of clinical medicine. And that's when I had to actually take matters into my own hands, I guess, and find something else.
Okay, so what were the challenges that you faced when you were looking then for something else?
Well, naturally, being somebody that was, just focused on medicine and thinking that was it. The very obvious challenge was actually what could I really do outside of medicine, because there is this, I guess, a myth that medicine is a very technical profession, which it is, and that opportunities would be limited to do anything outside of anything clinically or medically or technically related. So what I had to do was actually, I would say, sort of understand what were my strengths in general and try to map it out into the things that I actually am good at and what I like to do. So once you actually discover what is that sweet spot in terms of your own personality and your own competency, so to speak, then I would kind of go in that direction to find what would be suitable for me. So it involved a lot of self-discovery, I would say.
Okay.
And also a lot of research, online to find out whether, there are any opportunities for doctors that are looking for something outside of clinical medicine, and which obviously, there were a lot of things that I discovered. Mostly were low-hanging fruits, such as working in a pharmaceutical company, with various medical-based roles, or even things like commercial roles. So those are the kind of things that I was looking at, but I wasn't really quite sure at the time. What really helped me was that I reached out to somebody I knew who was an executive coach, and he actually had experience in working with various companies in Malaysia, and I was able to bounce some ideas with him to find out what would really be suitable for me.
And so I think that's a very critical point. A lot of doctors who are looking at alternative careers look at it through a very narrow lens. That executive coach probably helped you to have a much wider lens in terms of opportunities and options.
Absolutely. He also presented me a very structured approach to actually figure out what would work and what might not work. So I owe a lot to him, because if it were not for him, I probably wouldn't have made a successful career transition, so to speak.
Okay, so then tell us a little bit of your career as a post-medical professional.
Right.
What have you been doing since then?
Right. So after leaving the clinical field, I decided to go into marketing for a pharmaceutical company, specifically CCM Pharmaceuticals, which is now known as Duo Pharma Biotech. This is Malaysia's largest pharmaceutical manufacturing company. And the idea behind that was, I see myself as a creative person. In my spare time, I used to write music. I used to perform and compose songs. I also enjoy doing art. So
you're not a typical doctor then.
Well, thank you for the kind words, but I think there are a lot of doctors out there who are also the same. I've met a couple that also have similar interests and also similar career paths like me, where they've successfully transitioned out. I think doctors are generally quite creative in my opinion. But basically, it also helped that my eldest brother, he works in advertising, and I used to listen to him how he would craft out creative ideas and pitches, and also creative briefs with the meaning behind these kind of advertisements that he would be working on. So I actually thought at the time that marketing was advertising. I couldn't be further from the truth, but at that time, that's what I thought. So I put two and two together. Listen, I'm a medical doctor. I like advertising, so I think I can do marketing. and I could do marketing for a pharmaceutical company because pharmaceutical companies like to hire doctors. So let's give that a try.
Okay.
So that's where I started. I managed to secure a assistant manager position at the CCM Pharmaceuticals. And I remember on my first day, I remember coming to my desk and there was a calculator there on my desk, and I'd be thinking, what do I need this for? I thought marketing was advertising and stuff like that. So that really was my first real school of business when I worked at the CCM Pharmaceuticals, because it really was the best training ground for me to be exposed to business management.
Okay, so you obviously did a couple of commercial roles over the last few years.
Yeah.
And then, what do you do in your current role?
Right. So at the moment, I am so just to quickly finish off where I left off, from the pharmaceutical company in CCM, I was promoted to a product manager. Then from a product manager, that was about a span of nearly 4 years, I took some time off to do an MBA, because at that point I realized that, this was it. There was no turning back to clinical medicine. I wanted to actually legitimize my business experience. So I did an MBA in Singapore. I then moved on to a startup company where I was the head of business development, and which introduced me to this clinical diagnostic space, where I became a commercial director for Gribble's Pathology, which is one of the prominent laboratories here in Malaysia.
Yep.
And following from there on, after about 2.5 years, I'm now the head of new business for Pathology Asia, which is the holding company of laboratories like Gribble's, based out in Singapore.
Fantastic. And that's really a great transition from a clinical career then to now a senior role in a commercial space in healthcare. Could you tell us what, in your opinion, are readily transferable skills that doctors have that they can transfer to the corporate arena?
Right. I think the most obvious one would be communication skills. Now, I know that sounds very general because pretty much everybody is supposed to have communication skills, right? But certainly when I was studying as a medical doctor in medical school, there was a lot of emphasis on communication skills. For instance, we were taught how to break bad news, which is a skill that, if somebody got diagnosed with cancer, you as a doctor must be equipped to know how to break bad news in the most empathetic way possible, but very factual as well, and be able to deal with, the different kind of responses that you may get. Medical doctors also have to explain very complex procedures, for example, to patients, and have to break it down in a language that they would have to understand. So I feel that a doctor should be able to have these great verbal and nonverbal communication skills in order to communicate with whoever they are, whether it's a customer, whether it's a colleague, any kind of stakeholder involved. So people say that that's a emotional intelligence. That's the skill that they have, which I tend to agree. And having great emotional intelligence is the ability to actually read a room, to actually put yourselves in the other person's shoes, actually is quite beneficial when it comes to things like negotiations. So it's a very underrated skill, I believe, that medical doctors don't realize how they can bring that over to not just a corporate role, but any other role that they desire. So that's the first thing that comes to my mind. The other thing that I think is very, very, again, overlooked is the fact that medical doctors, the way they are able to critically analyze information and able to suggest plans or solutions following that critical analysis is something that we do as in the corporate sector, in business management. So what I mean by that is, if a patient comes over to see a doctor, typically the doctor will do is to take a history first, to ask open-ended questions, and then slowly narrow down to what the problem may be. Once the doctor gathers enough information, there should be a working diagnosis in the doctor's mind. The doctor then validates that information by examining the patient, after examination patient, the doctor may want to order some investigations, like an X-ray or a blood test, and then using that data, you confirm your diagnosis, and then you outline your management plan, whether you want to treat with this antibiotic, this medicine, etc. Right? So the train of thought that a doctor uses is very similar to how a marketeer, approaches a business problem. So for example, if you look at the report, okay, our revenue is 20% behind what was supposed to be forecasted. Why is that? So again, using the same train of thought, you have to narrow down where the problem is. Okay, the revenue has dropped in the Klang Valley area within our clinic customers. And then you find out, okay, which clinic customers are affected? Oh, this and this and this. Okay. And then you have to go down and meet these customers and ask some questions about why, what could be the problem. The customer says, oh, there's a new competitor that's come on board. It's a lot cheaper price than whatever you're offering. Then you validate that with other customers in the area, and it's true. So then you've already arrived at your diagnosis. So now the plan is, how do I address this? And so this is where, again, this is when, a little bit of skill and art comes into play to actually try to determine what to do next. But the point I'm trying to make is you can appreciate the similarity in the terms of thinking between a marketeer and a clinician. So those are a transferable skill, I would believe, that makes the transition easy.
So that's quite an interesting perspective, because while hearing you out, the other career that I think then doctors would be very suitable for is really becoming management consultants, because essentially the analytical skills, the ability to, as you correctly pointed out, go through the process, asking the right questions, validating the hypothesis and so forth. That's really the job of a management consultant. And I don't think a lot of doctors think of management consulting as a potential career opportunity.
It's funny you say that, Brian, because in Singapore, when I was there, I met a couple of clinicians who had gone on to become business consultants within the within the healthcare industry. So maybe you're right in the sense in Malaysia, maybe that's not really an option that they were thinking of. But certainly when I was in Singapore, I met a couple who made that transition, because as you rightly said, consulting, the methodology of consulting is very similar to what a clinician does. And just to add on to that point, being a consultant, you obviously have to have a knack for numbers, right? And clinicians, they might feel that, oh, but I don't really deal with numbers. I mean, I look at them, but I don't really know it. But again, I think more credit needs to be given to them, because as a doctor, you typically would be exposed to clinical journals, which there are plenty of study, because doctors are, they are data driven. They are factual based, so they would have to review a lot of papers over time to see what would be the new treatments and whether it actually works or not. So they are used to actually looking at statistics and looking at numbers, which again, as a business consultant or any kind of business manager would have to do in order to formulate decisions and plans. So those are the, as you rightly said, those are the kind of things that are very similar between a clinician and a consultant or a business manager.
Now, as we talked about hard skills, we talked about soft skills, we talked about methodologies and thought processes, but then there's the other element of hard skills. Now, did you then fill the gaps or plug the gaps by doing that MBA?
I did, yes. I did that, but I think a lot of credit was also given to, again, the first company that I joined, which is CCM Pharmaceuticals. They really invested in me in terms of sending me for a lot of training. There was a lot of skills that I was missing. So the most obvious one to me was Microsoft Excel. As a clinician, you don't use Excel at all. I mean, I don't think so anyway. And then I realized that, to be a solid marketer, you actually have to have a knack in terms of actually, coming up with data analysis and, and projections and all, and forecasting and all those kind of things. So it was it was one of those hard skills that was missing when I joined, and I had to actually go through a number of courses to actually make sure I was up to speed with my colleagues. The other skill gap I would say that perhaps a lot of doctors might also be missing is public speaking. Because even though I did say that communication skills should be something that a doctor should already have, public speaking is a little bit different because as a doctor, normally you engage in one-to-one discussions like how we're talking. When you're addressing a large group of people, a different skill set is required. And that is something that I also had to pick up because my job back then and even now requires me to speak to a large audience. So by the time I actually did my MBA, because of all this, the trainings that I went at CCM, as well as the kind of exposure I got working for a local company, doing the MBA was quite straightforward. I was able to relate a lot of the teachings at the MBA, a lot of the courses I could relate to my work experience I've gone through. So that just fortified my experience in that sense.
And in that case, actually, to be honest, for a lot of quality MBAs, that's really what they're looking for. They're looking for people to really bring their work experience to the program, contribute to their classmates, and then make, that MBA graduate just that more well-rounded, that finished product.
Absolutely, I agree. And I think there is a trend that, I mean, I may be wrong, but I think there's a trend that it's almost like a prerequisite to do an MBA, as soon as possible. Basically, I think there's a lot of young graduates, as soon as they get maybe 1 or 2 years of work experience, they feel that they are perhaps ready to do an MBA. And I think there's a real not danger, but I think it will still be a bit of a disadvantage when you don't have enough work experience to actually relate to the modules or the concept that are taught in the MBA program. As you rightly said, I was quite fortunate that I had enough experience at that point in time, because not only did I have my clinical years as working experience, but also in my time at the pharmaceutical company. So when you add it all together, I was able to add value to the whole course with my colleagues as well.
Now, Izzhar, it's been a fascinating conversation. I think you will inspire a lot of doctors who are perhaps thinking of looking at alternative careers outside of the clinical side of medicine. Now, before you leave us, any final thoughts you'd like to share with the audience?
Thank you for the kind words again, Brian. Final thoughts, I would just say that it's very important for doctors to make their own life decisions. I recognize, I mean, just to share a little bit of my own personal story, is that I got into medicine because somebody in the family must follow dad, pretty much. And that is quite a common theme amongst Asian families. And medicine is a very traditional, it's viewed as a very traditional profession. So while it's still, to me, it's the most noble profession out there, if it's something that wasn't entirely yours to begin with, if it wasn't something that you really wanted to do, then I would say to whoever is watching is that take some time to actually think about, who you are and what you like to do, what you're good at, because to be a great doctor, you really have to live and breathe medicine. It has to be more than a job. So for me, I enjoyed being a doctor. Certainly, like I mentioned, it's the most noble profession that I was grateful to actually gone through that. But it wasn't enough for me because I was not the type of doctor that was very keen on learning about new developments in the field of medicine, to look at research and update my own clinical knowledge about new discoveries and things like that. I was not that type of doctor, and I really truly feel that it's something that you have to give 110% commitment if you want to last as a clinician. So that's my message, basically, to really think hard whether this is it. And the same goes to parents who want to get their children to do medicine. It's a very important thing to really think hard about before committing into something like clinical medicine.
Now, thank you very much for coming on the show and speaking to us.
It's a pleasure. Thank you, Brian. Thanks for having me.
I'm Brian Fernandez, and we've been speaking to Dr. Izzhar Putra bin Amirudin, the head of new business at Pathology Asia, on BizTech's Jobs and Careers show. This conversation is part of our partnership with Diverse Career Summit 2022. This video and podcast will be on our platforms as well as our website, www.biztech.asia. Please like and subscribe to our various platforms. Thanks again for tuning in.